Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic turning point that U.S. intelligence officials, Western defense planners, and NATO strategists had quietly feared for months. Not because it came without warning, but because they knew exactly what it would mean when it finally happened. This was not a decision shaped over months of negotiations or years of strategic planning. It unfolded rapidly, in hours. And those hours have altered the direction of the war, forced Washington to reassess its entire strategy, and left European capitals struggling to anticipate what comes next. Earlier today, President Volodymyr Zelensky crossed a threshold that the White House had hoped would hold. And when that threshold was crossed, the response from Washington was immediate. CIA Director William Burns moved quickly, calm, direct, and unmistakably firm. According to multiple sources, he delivered one of the most serious warnings Moscow has received from U.S. intelligence leadership since the war began. Tonight, we break down what changed, why it happened now, and what it means for the future of the conflict. Because this wasn't simply a shift in Ukrainian policy. It was a shift in the geopolitical balance of Eastern Europe. And the consequences will echo far beyond this moment. For months, subtle signals had been emerging from Kyiv, not through official statements, not through public diplomacy, but through silence. Zelensky, known for his defiant tone, suddenly went quiet, scheduled appearances disappeared, rhetoric softened. Senior advisors began holding discreet meetings with European leaders, meetings that were never announced and rarely acknowledged. For intelligence analysts, this pattern was unmistakable. When a wartime leader goes silent, something significant is coming. Behind closed doors, Zelensky was engaged in private discussions with key allies, discussions that even members of his own government were only partially aware of. At the center of those conversations was a question that had once been unthinkable in Kyiv. What would it take to truly end the war? Not pause it, not freeze it, end it. The pressure driving this shift had been building steadily. Ukraine's counteroffensive had stalled. Western military aid, while still flowing, had become less predictable as political divisions deepened in Washington and across Europe. And the human cost of the war had reached a breaking point. Quietly, a new conversation began to take shape. A conversation about compromise, about limits, and ultimately about Crimea. Early today, Western intelligence agencies detected unusual diplomatic activity from Kyiv. Communication channels that had been dormant for over a year suddenly came alive. These channels are only used when a major shift is imminent. Within hours, the picture became clear. President Zelensky signaled that Ukraine would be willing to discuss the future status of Crimea not as an immediate demand, but as an issue deferred to future generations. In practical terms, Ukraine would no longer insist on the immediate return of Crimea as a condition for peace. This was not recognition of Russian sovereignty. Ukrainian officials were careful to emphasize that, but it was an acknowledgement that Crimea would no longer block negotiations. For many in the West, this announcement was shocking. For others, it was inevitable. But in Washington, it triggered alarm. The concern was not that Zelensky had made the wrong decision. The concern was how Vladimir Putin would interpret it. History has shown that the Kremlin often reads flexibility as weakness. Every previous sign of Ukrainian openness had been met not with compromise, but with greater demands, U.S. Intelligence officials feared that this moment could invite escalation rather than peace. That is why William Burns acted. According to officials briefed on the exchange, Burns delivered a clear message to Moscow through long-established intelligence channels that remain open even as diplomacy has frozen. The message was blunt. Any attempt by Russia to exploit Ukraine's flexibility militarily or politically would trigger a significant response from the United States and its allies. This was not symbolic. This was not rhetorical. Burns is one of the few American officials the Kremlin takes seriously. A former ambassador to Russia, he understands how Moscow thinks and how it miscalculates. And tonight, he spoke in a language the Kremlin understands. At the same time, the United States began moving on multiple fronts. Intelligence assets across Eastern Europe were placed on heightened alert. Satellite surveillance intensified. Communications monitoring expanded. Human intelligence networks inside Russia were activated. These are not routine measures. These are steps taken when escalation is a real possibility. The Pentagon accelerated delivery of defensive weapons to Ukraine with a particular focus on air defense systems. The concern: Russia may attempt a large-scale aerial campaign to pressure Kyiv into further concessions. Diplomatically, Washington moved fast. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke with key European allies within hours. The message was unified and urgent. Western cohesion must hold. Any perception of division would be exploited by Moscow, and any hint that Ukraine was being abandoned would have consequences far beyond this war. Quietly, NATO also began contingency planning. Scenarios once considered unlikely are now being discussed openly at the highest levels: massive offensives, nuclear threats, attacks on NATO logistics hubs. These discussions alone reveal how seriously this moment is being taken. Intelligence analysts now believe Zelensky's announcement was designed to send multiple messages at once. To the Ukrainian people, it signaled that every possible path to peace is being explored. To Western allies, it demonstrated realism and flexibility. And to Moscow, it may have been a calculated test. If Russia responds with escalation, Ukraine strengthens its case for continued Western support. If Russia responds with flexibility, negotiations move forward. But the risk is real. If Moscow chooses an unexpected path, events could move faster than Kyiv intends. That is why the CIA's warning matters. Burns wasn't just trying to deter escalation. He was shaping the environment around the negotiations themselves, limiting Putin's options before decisions are made. As the day unfolded, signs from Russia only deepened concern. Military activity increased along multiple fronts. Russian state media launched a coordinated narrative portraying Ukraine as collapsing, and the Kremlin itself went silent. That silence is often the calm before a decision. Tonight, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian nation. His tone was measured, serious, resolute. He made it clear: Ukraine's willingness to talk is not weakness. Ukraine remains united, and peace cannot be a pause before the next war. This is the tightrope he must walk, offering flexibility without surrendering strength. The next few days will reveal whether that balance holds. Because what happens next will be decided not by speeches, but by actions. By choices made in Moscow, Kyiv, Washington, and Brussels. The next 72 hours will shape the trajectory of the war for months, possibly years. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, the Kremlin appears uncertain. When Putin is quiet, he is calculating, and the world is watching.